I'd like to now invite our first panel up to the stage. So Jia Lynn Yang will moderate this panel. Ms. Yang is the national editor at the New York Times. And joining her, we have Jonathan Cohen, Senior Program Officer at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, where he leads the organization's work on the economy. Suzanne Mettler, the John L. Senior Professor of American Institutions and Government, Department at Cornell University, and Paul Pierson.
And I'm excited to talk to this panel because I feel like one core question that we are also wrestling with probably since November 2016 is the why. Why is this happening before you get to the what? So I'm eager to dive in. Why don't we just start with that question? So what, you all have thought deeply. What are, in your view, the main causes of what we're seeing right now?
Okay, nice, easy one to start. I would say a single lane. Well, let me say first of all that I'm here in my capacity at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, but I wrote the essay for this series with Kathy Kramer at the University of Wisconsin. So I apologize that I don't have like a charming Midwestern accent, but I am going to sort of, in all this, sort of channel her and what I hope she would say as well, which is, again, if I'm going to distill it down to, let's say, one word to start, and it's a word I think Jacob or someone else used earlier, let's say the word status in terms of actual economically or politically, but also of chasing this American dream and this corporate ladder that they used to be able to climb reliably of sports gambling has sort of like become like the bet on like right-wing populism.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to give a quick answer to. So hopefully what we all say will kind of fit together. I mean, I think I would start with the fact that this is happening all across the affluent world. Right? It's not, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this. It's not a distinctly American phenomenon, and so I think that helps us to place a little better what is going on. And I would begin. Jacob was saying a little bit about this. We are going through a profound economic transformation. The transformation some people would call knowledge economy or post-industrial economy, shift towards much more service-oriented employment. And that is, I think in many ways, that is as profound a change as a change from an agrarian to an industrial economy. It's hugely disruptive for half a century. So I had force tends to ways that many
voted random in presidential elections. And then in the later 90s, this gap began that was particularly driven by rural Americans moving more and more to the Republican Party with each election. And we looked at congressional voting. It happened there as well. It's a very and we've collected place-based data, county-level data, all cases based on contemporary data. What we find is that as the period from 1992 to 2004, it was driven by what I was talking about, agricultural consolidation, the demise of family farms. You have loss of lots of jobs in extractive enterprise to realize what a large component of rural counties' employment that had been and how much had been lost. And so what we find in our quantitative analysis, controlling for all of these other things, is that in counties that saw jobs stagnating or worse yet declining, those were the counties that have moved the most toward voting for Republican candidates, and particularly in that period, the late 90s, early 2000s, and they are rural counties. And then we saw the same thing for counties that were losing population, that they experienced the same trend. There were subsequent things that happened that deepened the divide. I won't talk about that right now, but I just want to emphasize the point that, you know, in the United States, as Jacob mentioned, that have less population, and that's always been the case. But in the past, both parties have benefited from that, so they've kind of washed each other out. Now they're consolidated in many different aspects of government.
These are great answers for a question that's been chewed over a lot. So you guys did great. So Paul, maybe dig a little bit deeper into a point that you were mentioning just now, that this is a global phenomenon. Curious, what are the differences then, and what does that mean for going forward?
Yeah, it is global, and I think that has. So, and I agree, like the rural-urban divide, you see that in lots of countries that are having this kind of experience. You also see huge divides around education, around gender, around race. All those things show up cross-nationally. How's the U.S. distinctive, and what difference does that make? And here, so we were talking before about you didn't want to follow Sarah. Following Jacob is a problem because he made the 2 points that I was planning on making. It reminds me of the joke about faculty meetings where somebody near the end says, everything has been said, but not everybody has said it, and then proceeds to say it. But I think actually I can take the 2 points and just push them a little bit further. And I think the starting point to think about the U.S. comparatively is right-wing populism is not uniquely popular in the United States compared with other countries. But I think it is uniquely powerful compared with other rich democracies. Right? Not uniquely popular. I would say you have about 30% support in like country after country for sort of what we would think of as the core of a right-wing populist agenda. But the U.S. is different in two critical respects, and one of them is about institutions. And Suzanne's point is exactly right about the kind of rural bias of American institutions, especially the Senate. But of course, it carries over really powerfully to the Supreme Court. It's amazing that Republicans have lost a popular vote over and over again in presidential elections, and yet they have 6 seats on the Supreme Court. Right? And that is largely because of the bias of the Electoral College and the bias of the U.S. Senate. Right? So rural bias is important. The other thing about institutions that I think is super important that Americans take for granted, we have a two-party system, basically because of our constitutional arrangements. Right? And a two-party system, which most countries do not have this arrangement. With the two-party system, the right-wing populists have to capture one political party. right? And then if it happened in the US because of polarization, Eric Schickler and I have a recent book on this partisan nation, which talks through how our political system has become nationalized. It's nationalized polarization, and that means that the parties act much more as unified blocs. So this makes right-wing populism able to leverage that 30% into political power and then operate in very dangerous ways, right? Because of the way our parties have now become teams, like the complete capitulation of Congress, for example. And we'll see about the Supreme Court, but I'm not hugely optimistic about the Supreme Court, which the majority of which is also part of the Republican team, right? So one is this point about institutions, and the other is about what Jacob and I call plutocratic populism, right? Which is absolutely distinctive about American politics. And I don't want to go on too long, so I won't say much more about this, except to say, so Jacob and I wrote a book called Winner Take All Politics back in 2010, right? At which point we were talking about how much the rise of top-end income and wealth inequality was eroding the quality of American democracy, right? And empowering, we weren't calling them plutocrats then, but empowering plutocrats. Well, in 2010, the top 25,000 donors in the US, that's 1/100th of 1% of people giving money to campaigns, 25,000 people, they gave about 30%, right, of the money that went to federal elections, right? 30% coming from the top 1/100th of 1% of donors, 25,000 people. Right? Now the top 400 donors give almost 30% of the money for federal elections. Right? Thank you, Citizens United, and a bunch of other decisions like that. Thank you, growing increases of wealth and income inequality in the US. So American economy has become much more unequal, and the translation of that economic inequality into political inequality has moved much, much further in the period since 2010. It's really astonishing, and other countries don't see anything like this. There's a lot more to be said about that. I'll just say one thing, which is, I do think as we lead into the next panel, we're thinking about what do we do. In some ways, plutocratic populism creates really important opportunities because plutocrats are not popular. Right? Plutocrats are not popular. Right? A lot of what these governments, and this was true of Trump 1, it was actually true of Bush 2, and it's definitely super wealthy that are not popular and are going to create important political opportunities.
Can I ask, I'm just curious, the plutocrats in other countries, where do they fit in for their politics?
Well, so first of all, there aren't as many. They don't have nearly as much wealth. I mean, astonishing, and we've all seen it, right? So Trump is giving his inaugural address, right? And the 3 wealthiest men in the world, 5 of the 7 wealthiest men in the world, one of them actually a French national, right? We're on the stage behind him, right? That's happening in American elections. I mean, just a level of wealth, the concentration of wealth is much greater in the United States than it is.
John, I was really fascinated by your essay with Kathy because you're looking at economic measures and you're kind of speaking directly to one of the other ongoing mysteries of the 2024 campaign where Democrats kept asking, the economy's so great, why is everyone so unhappy? And you asked some, I think, pretty provocative questions about what we're even measuring. And I thought of your essay this morning when there was another, 3 alerts on my phone about inflation, not so bad. And then I thought, well, does that really tell us much about how the country's actually doing? So say a little bit more about what we're missing, and when you look at the other measures that you would actually point to, what do we find out?
Yeah, I mean, Senator Brown sort of alluded to this too about sort of when we talk about how is the economy doing, we're really talking about how is inflation doing, how's the stock market doing, and how the Dow Jones and maybe unemployment rate if you're lucky. And we've sort of reduced the economy to 4 things, which first of all, some people take issue with how those are actually calculated. And if you dig into the surface of how inflation gets calculated, it's a little iffier than you would think. It's not just the price of eggs, which obviously was sort of the headline of the election. And so sort of build on that assumption, representing this broader commission that I worked on at the Academy that included Jacob as well, who might as well be on this panel at this point. We built sort of what we see as sort of like an alternative measure rooted in not like economic growth for the sake of economic growth, but by our measure, our sort of North Star for economic measures should be well-being and like how Americans are actually doing. And so our composite measure, our aggregate index, is built on a grouping of sort of economic security, economic opportunity, health, and political voice, on the assumption that sort of those measures taken together in some sort of weird cocktail offer a better indication, specifically at the county level, or at least at the sub-national, or maybe the sub-state level, of like how Americans are actually doing. I don't want to sound like an ad for our tool, which is free, and you can all go on it online. And I can say more about sort of the...
We should all go check it out, but go on.
Okay, but I'll say this. Lots of people complain about GDP and then propose alternate measures to GDP that, lo and behold, track at like a 95% correlation to GDP. And I promise that ours does not track at a 95% correlation to GDP. Like over the last 10 years, our top scoring states are Minnesota, North Dakota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. Because again, this is not about like Los Angeles County probably has a larger GDP than all those states combined, but it's not about like how much economic growth you produce in the aggregate. It is about like how well off people in your places, in those places, are doing along these various scores, of which actual sort of raw economics is only one, and your political voice and how well represented you are is sort of an equally weighted measure in how well you're doing in a democratic society.
While we're picking on the traditional measures, can you, I was struck by what you all wrote about the unemployment rate, which again, you're like, well, GDP is just making more, goes to the wealthy. Unemployment, surely.
Oh, it's just people who are unemployed, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, but say more about even why that one has some issues that are worth pondering.
Right.
Here.
So it seems like the most obvious measure. It's like unemployed rate. It's like the percentage of people who are unemployed. But it's not. It's like if you've been unemployed for a certain amount of time, you're like considered out of the labor market, and you don't count in the factor. If you're underemployed, you're still counted as being either employed or unemployed, depending on sort of the various field. So even like these purest distillations, you would think that sort of how could you possibly argue with the unemployment rate? Actually, you can, and you can quibble with them. You can probably quibble with my measure too, but at least like the ones that we've like sort of taken as sort of the proxies for the economy as a whole are not as sort of pure as we might imagine.
Yeah. And then do you have an example of a particular, so let's talk about some of these places. I guess the ones you've mentioned, like Wisconsin. I mean, I think of there are towns there. I mean, as a journalist, we don't deal purely in data, but we're talking to people visiting towns. I mean, there are a lot of, look at Milwaukee, not doing so hot. So what I guess is surprising to you, or, you know, what are we missing in a place like Wisconsin, for instance?
What was during the Obama administration, but took place in Wisconsin, where you go to rural places and, you know, talk to people and sort of do that journalistic work. I would say I think it's a counter narrative to what at least I saw in the aftermath of the 2016 election, which is a lot of journalists going to like rural diners in Wisconsin or wherever and being like, oh, this is why Trump won because
NAFTA.
Yeah, or whatever is going on in this diner explains like the last, you know, 5 years of American politics. And by our measure, like, sort of like, what's the matter with Kansas? Like, not a lot. Or like, at least not a lot, like, relative to other places. So going back to the conversation about my point about status is like, there's one thing about how well off you are, and there's a whole separate thing about how well off you are, or you felt like they were getting a raw deal from, you know, plutocrats in Madison or whatever, but they were actually getting a higher percentage of the state tax revenue in redistributive services, but it didn't feel like that. And I don't know how you like address people's feelings, but I think that's it's nice to think that we live in sort of an objective society where everything's rooted in data, but of course we live in a narrative-driven one and a subjective one where like feelings actually are more important than facts sometimes.
Yes, I think we keep learning that over and over. Suzanne, would love your sense of just some historic perspective. I think especially these days, I feel like we ebb and flow with the number of Nazi Germany analogies that I hear, so I just feel like history generally, like, you know, and certainly there's enough news to make you ponder, has this ever happened before? Where are we?
Yes.
So would love your thoughts. You've written a historical analysis on the threats that come from this kind of populism in American history. So would just love to hear more from you about where we fit in the not terribly long history of this country, but history nonetheless.
Okay. Well, I teach every year, or almost every year at Cornell, I teach this big class on Intro to American Politics. And it was becoming more and more mind-bending. I mean, you had to like rethink every lecture every year. And then along comes 2016. And, you know, I'm throwing up my hands. And I would run into my colleagues who study democratic deterioration around the world. And they seemed to understand much better than me what was going on. They had a vocabulary, they had concepts. And so I thought I need to begin to learn more from these folks. And so we formed this American Democracy Collaborative, and we have Americanists and comparativists learning from each other. And so then Robert Lieberman and I said, you know, what do we know historically about times in the American past that democracy has been in crisis? So what we learned from the comparativists is that there are 4 main threats that can endanger democracies around the world. And one is political polarization, when politics move to becoming like us versus them. Another is when politics gets to be this conflict over who belongs, who's considered a member of society, who has full status. A third is high and rising economic inequality. And then the 4th one is executive aggrandizement, or the consolidation of power in the top leader. So what Rob and I did was we looked at periods throughout American history, and we found that in fact, American democracy has been fragile on multiple occasions, time and again. And already, like right out of the gate in the 1790s, political polarization started raging, even among people who had been just before that drafting the Constitution together and saying they weren't even going to have political parties. And so it almost, the nation almost went down the tubes by the time you get to the election of 1800. Then you get in the 1850s, the first 3 threats together are all combining and interacting, and it leads to the Civil War, so secession and Civil War. Then in the 1890s, 1850s was the lead up to the Civil War. Then you get to the 1890s, and here you have, on the one hand, there's the really referring to what Sherrod Brown was calling populism. There was the agrarian populist movement in the United States, which was really a movement for redistribution and to producers, both farmers and in industry. But you have, a lot of elites in both parties who are threatened by that. And you also have Black men, millions of Black men who've now been voting at actually really high levels for a few decades in the South. And what happens is that, the 3 threats emerge, and there's this resurgence of white supremacy in the South. And then the Republican Party in the North goes in another direction. And so, and you have, but the disenfranchisement of Black men for 60 years. This is major backsliding that happened in the United States, and it lasts 60 years. And once people have lost their voting rights, they lose their civil rights as well. In the 20th century, there were 2 occasions where there was one major threat that led to democracy being in danger. And the first was actually during the New Deal. But, we do see the internment of Americans of Japanese descent, and in, the early 1940s during World War II, the growth of a national security apparatus that can engage in wiretapping and so on. But for the most part, Roosevelt is using these new executive powers on behalf of the American people. Not so when we get to Watergate, right? We have all 4 threats have been growing for some time now and combining. And so, we wrote this book, we published it in 2020, 4 threats, and saying that, like, these are very dangerous background conditions, broad background conditions in which democracy can be in peril. The particular story that happens in any time period is different, but it's dangerous time.
And how in those past instances that you looked at, because it sounds like you're describing kind of an ebb and a flow, who knows where we are in that, but if we look in the past, how does it come back?
How does democracy come back?
Yep.
Yeah. It's, I wish I could say there's a really nice answer.
Doesn't
to
have
that.
to be. It could be the beginning of an answer.
But it's really discouraging when you look at the past. I mean, many of the earlier periods, there was a settlement at some point, and it was on the backs of Black Americans. And, you know, that was even true really in the New Deal, when the New Deal Democratic Party was, you know, for Roosevelt to deliver to the American people, he relied upon this big Democratic Party that included a lot of folks in the North and in urban areas and new immigrants with Southern white elites who were keeping Jim Crow intact. The one period where the outcome is a good outcome is actually after Watergate, where there's real bipartisan efforts in Congress to create all sorts of reforms, which have, you know, many of them lasted until just recently, like inspectors generals, et cetera. But you know, that was a time of low political polarizations that was possible. We're not now in that time period.
You've all, I mean, a number of you have brought up inequality. And so how does that translate into this move toward populism, right? So people see that. How does that turn into people see the government, how they see their country, how they see their...
Okay, now I'm going to turn back to the rural-urban divide. And this picks up a little bit on Kathy Kramer's work. So I described to you how the rural-urban divide began to emerge because of changes in the economy that left rural places behind. But then what happens next, we find, again, looking at our data analysis, but also from interviews that we did with political party county chairs, Democrats and Republicans in counties that have changed dramatically over time politically, is that there was this growing sense that Democrats are urban elites and they're engaging in overreach. They're overbearing elites. So they are rolling out these policies that we in urban places have to implement, but nobody consulted us in the process, and the way it's all coming down is very overbearing. What's interesting is that we find that rural and urban people do not disagree very much on the purposes of those policies themselves, like public opinion, support for you know, all kinds of types of government spending, like on health and education, et cetera. There's not a significant difference between people. But the theme kept coming out that people feel that Democrats are overbearing elites. And part of that has to do with what Paul mentioned earlier, and that is this growing educational divide. And so, you know, as in the 1990s, people who are living in urban areas who have more education started gravitating toward the Democratic Party. And then subsequently, after 2008, people in rural areas started to follow the same pattern, but it's mostly people with less education. They're gravitating toward to the Republican Party. And so this theme came out again and again of what to do.
So two things I would say about inequality and right-wing populism. And the first comes out of, the story starts, I was in Paris in 2016. I got a chance to work and write there for about a month, and I shared an office with a lovely man, scholar named Daniel Ziblatt, of democracy in the early 20th century, and I was working on some stuff with Jacob on the evolution of the Republican Party, and Daniel and I had many wonderful conversations that just got us more and more depressed. We saw the parallel Germany and what we were looking at, and the way I would summarize that would be to say that high inequality makes conservative parties the enemy of democracy. That's a slight oversimplification, but high inequality makes conservative parties the enemies of democracy, right? Because they want to defend inequality. A lot of their powerful backers defend inequality. And so really the only way that they can mobilize support in a competitive electoral system is by amping the rest of the electorate up, right? And you know, finding other enemies for them to oppose, right? that. And so, and you know, Jacob and I developed this argument in Let Them Meet Tweets. We produced in more on what's happening in the mass population, which we're finding is partly built on what Suzanne saying, like, right, which is, so what happens when conservative, which a lot of the voters they're trying to appeal to are so disillusioned about institutions, so disillusioned about government, right, that you create this, I think, very discouraging, certainly discouraging for a political scientist who's used to the idea that elections are going to kind of like force political elites to be at least somewhat responsive to the needs of their voters. There's a wonderful new book coming out, Wonderful Shepherd, which looks at what's happened around by Republican governments in these levels, including, you know, not accepting expansion, stuff like that. So that's a quite discouraging story, and I think it does just suggest it is profoundly important that people who don't think that's a great dynamic for any of us try to figure out how do you break that doom loop. And I think 4 years ago, a lot of political scientists thought, well, the way you do that, deliver is the way you do that. Design good policies that are actually really targeted, like, you know, a lot of this is going to go to red states, to rural communities, and it's not going to the blue state constituencies, you know, actually quite the opposite in a lot of cases, right? And people were willing to do that, and partly they thought, well, that's going to generate positive feedback. That's going to get us out of the doom loop. Give up on those ideas, but I think we need to realize now it is much, much harder to break that cycle than we thought, and that we probably need strategies that are not just about what, I mean, we do need to deliver those things, right? But it's not just about concretely what you deliver. That is seen and
Potentially provocative, talking about the need to strengthen democracy. Democracy is producing this outcome as well. So what does that tell us about democracy? I mean, this is what people,
yeah.
This is what people want.
Well, it's a highly biased democracy, right? And I mean, I will be honest with you. So I teach a class like Suzanne's class. How do you teach Introduction to American Politics to 300 Berkeley students who are, you know, 18 years old and really, honestly, have very little conception of how different this is? And how do you teach that in a way that's not just, oh, look, Berkeley professor with his hair on fire? You know, it's like, that doesn't work. It's really a challenge. But one thing that I come pretty close to saying these days, and for this audience, I feel comfortable saying, it's like, we should really, even before the astonishing things that are going on right now, right? You know, astonishing things that are going on right now. We should really question, right? Is the U.S. a democracy, right? And they're competitive. The system is unbelievably biased, right? I mean, the overrepresentation in the Senate, again, I mean, just that simple fact, Democrats, despite winning the popular election, right, have not appointed a majority of Supreme Court justices since the early 1970s, right? And extremely powerful Supreme Court, right, in comparative perspective. How democratic is that? How democratic is a system where 30% of the money, the huge amounts of money in federal elections, are coming from 400 people? Right? How democratic is that? You know, how democratic is a Senate where one party has had the majority in the Senate about half the time since 1996, even though it has never in that period represented a majority of voters? Never. Which hypothetically allows something like 17 or 18% of the US population to block legislation. Right? So I think I mean, obviously elections still matter a lot, and we need to understand why voters are voting for what they're voting for. But I think we really should ask questions about how, to what extent it's fair to call that system a democracy.
I'm just reminded of a Mencken quote that I'm going to butcher, which is, democracy is when people want something and they get it good and hard. And I think that's maybe part of the doom loop that Paul is describing. I'll just say on the inequality front, I think in addition to the sort of sexy data tool that you're all going to go check out immediately after this panel, we did sort of some qualitative conversations sort of around the country, and we don't see the sort of splitting of hairs that Paul and Suzanne have sort of so capably provided, of like people seeing like corporations over here and like political institutions over there. They see it as like a system, and it's like the system writ large is not working, and it's not like, oh, these politicians are working for me and these aren't. It's just like, no, politicians are working for me. The like how it's experienced and how it's treated. And then I would also say you asked about inequality, but I'm going to sort of answer a slightly different question, or at least I know this is debated, the degree to which inequality contributes to insecurity, but I think, again, it's sort of the problem and this lack of trust that people have in the system or in politics sort of specifically, that sort of leads down this rabbit hole towards populism, is related to this economic insecurity, again, which has its own feedback loop of you lack sort of economic resources or political standing. You become distrustful of the institutions that are best suited to improve your political representation and your economic standing. Those institutions get worse because people have lack of faith in them, and so on. So this is maybe a different doom loop to the one you're describing, but they all lead to doom. So what's sort of the difference? But again, so inequality, security relative to inequality.
All right. Well, thank you. I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you all so much for your insights, and thank you all for listening.